January 17, 1943. The morning sun breaks cold and pale over the airfield at Villacoublay, just outside occupied Paris. Frost clings to the wings of the Focke-Wulf 190s lined in perfect rows, their yellow noses gleaming like the teeth of wolves. Inside the heated briefing room, Oberleutnant Klaus Becker sits with his squadron, young men whose faces still carry the flush of invincibility. They smoke French cigarettes, stolen from shops that no longer bear the names of their former owners. The coffee is real, not ersatz, requisitioned from Dutch reserves. On the wall behind the commanding officer hangs a map of Europe, and across it, red pins mark the graves of Royal Air Force squadrons that dared challenge the Luftwaffe's dominion. Someone makes a joke about the Americans. There is laughter. It echoes off concrete walls built to withstand anything except the weight of what is coming. For 3 years, the pilots of the Luftwaffe had owned the skies of Europe. They had seen London burn beneath their wings, watched Warsaw crumble into ash and rubble, turned Rotterdam into a furnace in a single afternoon. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were not merely machines, they were extensions of a doctrine, instruments of blitzkrieg, the philosophy that speed and terror could shatter nations before they found the will to resist. These men had been trained in the cauldron of Spain, blooded over Poland, hardened above the cliffs of Dover. They knew the British Spitfire, respected its agility, cursed its maneuverability in the tight turns above the Channel. They knew the Hurricane, dependable and deadly when flown by a pilot willing to close the distance. But the Americans? The Americans were a rumor, a distant thunder that had not yet reached the heart of the Reich. Intelligence reports spoke of heavy bombers, four-engine giants called flying fortresses, lumbering across the Atlantic with crews who had never seen combat, piloted by boys from places with names like Iowa and Alabama, states that might as well have been planets in some distant galaxy. Let them come, the German pilots said. Let them come and learn what war truly means. The architects of German air superiority had built their confidence on experience and blood. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, corpulent and metal-draped, had promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. It was not an idle boast. The Luftwaffe had, by the winter of 1943, developed a layered defense system that seemed impregnable, radar stations along the Atlantic coast that could detect formations hundreds of miles away, fighter wings positioned in depth across France and the Low Countries, anti-aircraft batteries that turned the approaches to German cities into corridors of exploding steel. The philosophy was elegant in its brutality. Identify the bombers early, vector fighters to intercept over occupied territory, tear apart the formations before they could drop their payloads, then finish the cripples on their limping journey home. It had worked against the British. The RAF's daylight raids in 1939 and 1940 had been slaughtered, losses so catastrophic that Bomber Command abandoned daylight operations entirely and retreated into the relative safety of night. The Germans learned a simple truth from those encounters. Unescorted bombers, no matter how heavily armed, were flying coffins. And the Americans, in their arrogance, were proposing to fly deep into the Reich in broad daylight, without fighter cover, relying on formation, discipline, and machine guns to survive. It was to the experienced pilots of the Jagdwaffe, a strategy born of ignorance, destined to end in fire and shredded aluminum raining down on French fields. But beneath the mockery, beneath the casual confidence, there existed something the German pilots could not yet name, a faint unease, a whisper at the edge of consciousness. America was not Britain. America had not spent its blood and treasure in the trenches of the Somme, had not bled itself pale holding the line in 1914. America had factories that sprawled across horizons, steel mills that glowed like captured suns, assembly lines that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed by workers who had never heard an air raid siren. The intelligence photographs showed this, though few in the Luftwaffe high command wanted to acknowledge what they implied. A single factory complex in Willow Run, Michigan, larger than some German cities, producing 1B, 24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The Boeing plants in Seattle, where shifts of workers, including women, the reports noted with barely concealed disbelief, riveted together B-17s on assembly lines that stretched beyond the edges of reconnaissance photographs. This was not the production of a nation at war. This was the production of a nation that had industrialized warfare itself, that had transformed destruction into a commodity that could be manufactured, packaged, and delivered with the same efficiency that it produced automobiles and refrigerators. The German pilots did not see this yet. They saw only the first clumsy formations that appeared over occupied Europe in the late months of 1942, small groups, poorly coordinated, flying without the fighter escort that might have saved them. These early raids seemed to confirm everything the Luftwaffe believed about American incompetence. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17s attacked the rail yards at Rouen-Sotteville. It was a shallow penetration, barely across the channel, and still the Germans tore into them with predatory ease. The fortresses flew in a loose gaggle, their defensive fire uncoordinated, their formation discipline poor. 2 were shot down. The rest staggered home with casualties and damage. In the debriefing rooms at German fighter bases, the engagement was discussed with the tone reserved for training exercises. If this was American air power, the veterans concluded, then the war in the West was already won. Oberleutnant Becker remembered his first encounter with AB-17. It was over the North Sea, October 1942, a single fortress separated from its formation, struggling on 3 engines toward England. He approached from below and behind, the classic killing angle, and opened fire with his 20mm cannons. He expected the bomber to come apart. The British Wellingtons and Hamptons disintegrated under such attacks, their fabric-covered fuselages shredding like paper. But the B-17 absorbed the hits. He could see the round striking, see pieces flying off, see the tailgunner slumped in his position, but the bomber kept flying. He made another pass, and another, burning through his ammunition until the breeches clicked empty, and still the fortress flew on, wallowing through the air like a wounded animal refusing to die. It disappeared into the clouds, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, and he never learned if it made it home. The encounter troubled him, though he did not speak of it to his squadron mates. There was something unnerving about a machine that could absorb such punishment and continue flying, something that suggested a philosophy of construction fundamentally different from the elegant, weight-conscious designs of German engineering. The B-17 was not built to be efficient. It was built to survive. And survival, Becker was beginning to understand, had a mathematics all its own. Through the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943, the raids continued. They grew larger, more coordinated. The Americans were learning, absorbing the brutal lessons that came with each mission, refining their tactics with a methodical determination that the Germans had not anticipated. The tight defensive boxes began to appear, formations where each bomber's guns covered the blind spots of its neighbors, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire formation into a single, enormous weapon. German pilots who tried the old tactics, the lone wolf attacks from astern, found themselves flying into walls of .50 caliber tracers. The Americans had installed additional guns, tail turrets, ball turrets, waist guns, nose guns, until each B-17 bristled with machine guns, until approaching one was like flying into a metal storm. The casualty rates among Luftwaffe pilots began to climb. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough to be noticed in the quiet conversations after missions, in the lengthening lists of names that no longer appeared at morning briefings. And then came the deep penetrations. January 27, 1943. Wilhelmshaven. It was the first American raid against a German city, and the Luftwaffe rose to meet it with something approaching eagerness. Here, finally, was the chance to prove what they had been saying since the Americans arrived, that daylight bombing deep into the Reich was suicide, that no formation could survive the gauntlet of German fighters and flak. 91 B-17s and B-24s flew the mission. The German fighters swarmed them over the North Sea, wave after wave, attacking from every angle. The sky filled with contrails and smoke and pieces of falling aircraft. And yet the bombers kept coming. They held formation. They reached the target. They dropped their bombs on the U-boat yards through gaps in the smoke and fire. 3 bombers were lost. 3 out of 91. In the debriefing rooms at German fighter bases that evening, there was no laughter. The pilots sat in silence, smoking, staring at their hands, trying to reconcile what they had seen with what they had been told was possible. February brought more raids. March brought more. Each one penetrating deeper, each one larger than the last. The Americans were not simply sending bombers, they were sending armadas, hundreds of aircraft at a time, overwhelming the German defenses through sheer mass. The radar stations tracked them forming up over England, dozens of groups spiraling upward into assembly formations, joining into combat boxes, turning toward the continent like a migration of mechanical birds. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything they had, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, even the twin-engine Bf-110s pressed back into day fighter service despite their vulnerability. They attacked from head-on, discovering that the closure rate was so high that they had only seconds to aim and fire before flashing past at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. They attacked from above, diving through the formations, hoping to separate cripples from the herd. They attacked from below, trying to set fire to the bomb bays. Nothing stopped the boxes. Individual bombers fell, 10, 15, 20 per mission, but the formations held, and the formations reached their targets, and the formations dropped their bombs with an accuracy that improved with each mission. The German pilots began to understand that they were not fighting an air force in any sense they recognized. They were fighting an industrial system, a process that could absorb losses that would have destroyed any European nation, and simply produce more bombers, train more crews, send more missions. For every B-17 they shot down, 2 more appeared. For every American pilot killed, 3 more graduated from training schools in Texas and California and Florida, boys who grew up driving tractors and cars, who understood machines in a way that came from living in a mechanized society, who could keep a bomber flying on instinct and muscle memory, even after the instruments were shot to pieces. The Luftwaffe was fighting attrition warfare against an enemy that had made attrition into a science, that had calculated exactly how many bombers it needed to build, exactly how many crews it needed to train, exactly how many missions it needed to fly to reduce German industry to rubble. And the numbers, cold and immutable, favored America. The symbolic object that began to haunt German consciousness was not a weapon. It was a photograph. In April 1943, a damaged B-17 made an emergency landing at a Luftwaffe field in Belgium. The crew was captured unhurt, and the bomber was examined by German technicians with the thoroughness of men studying an artifact from an alien civilization. They cataloged everything. The armor plating around the crew positions. The self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb machine gun rounds without igniting. The oxygen system that allowed the crews to operate at altitudes where German pilots struggled. The heating system that kept the interior temperatures survivable even when the outside air was 60 below zero. The Norden bomb sight, a mechanical computer of bewildering complexity. But what transfixed the intelligence officers was what they found in the crew compartments: cigarettes, American brands, dozens of packs. Chocolate bars, real chocolate, not the ersatz compounds German soldiers received. Chewing gum. A deck of playing cards. A paperback novel. A photograph of a woman in a swimsuit, smiling at a beach somewhere in California, where there was no war, no rationing, no bombed cities. These were not the possessions of soldiers fighting for survival. These were the possessions of workers on a job, men who expected to return from their missions to hot showers and cooked meals and clean sheets, who flew through flak and fighters with the same workmanlike competence that their fathers brought to factory shifts. The photograph was copied and circulated among Luftwaffe squadrons, not as propaganda, but as evidence of something that could not be articulated, the understanding that they were fighting an enemy to whom this war was not existential, was not a struggle for survival, was merely the application of industrial capacity to a problem that needed solving. By summer, the raids had become routine. Hundreds of bombers, every day the weather allowed. The targets were oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, rail yards, submarine pens. The Americans flew with a methodical precision that was more terrifying than any blitzkrieg, because it was patient, because it did not seek a quick victory, but rather the systematic dismantling of the Reich's ability to wage war. The Luftwaffe fought back with increasing desperation. They developed new tactics, attacking in formation, 4 or 5 fighters at a time, concentrating their fire on a single bomber until it fell. They armed their planes with heavier weapons, 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-17 with a single well-placed hit, rockets that could be fired from outside the range of defensive guns. They experimented with ramming attacks, sacrificing their own aircraft and pilots to bring down bombers. Some pilots did it deliberately, flying their damaged fighters into the wings or tails of fortresses, bailing out at the last second, trusting to luck and parachutes. It worked sometimes. It was also insane, a tactic of desperation that spoke to the growing recognition that conventional methods were failing. March 6, 1944, the day the skies over Berlin went dark. 814 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, escorted by 943 fighters, attacked the Reich capital in broad daylight. Göring's promise, no enemy bomber will ever reach Berlin, shattered like the glass in 10,000 windows across the city. The flak was intense, the heaviest the Americans had encountered, a carpet of bursting shells that turned the sky black and filled the air with shrapnel. German fighters rose to intercept, but the Mustangs were waiting, and the dogfights that erupted over Brandenburg were brief and one-sided. The bombers flew through the flak with the same inexorable patience they brought to every mission, released their bombs on the rail yards and tank factories and government buildings, and turned for home. 69 bombers were lost, along with 11 fighters. It was a high price. But Berlin burned, and the people of the city, who had been told for years that the Luftwaffe protected them, that German air defenses were invincible, now understood that neither was true. Oberleutnant Klaus Becker was killed on April 11, 1944, over Brunswick. His squadron intercepted a formation of B-17s bombing an oil refinery. He pressed his attack despite the escort fighters, despite the defensive fire, despite the fact that his wingmen had already been shot down. He fired his last rockets at a fortress, saw them strike the wing root, saw the fire bloom and spread. The bomber fell away, trailing smoke and pieces. It was his 23rd confirmed kill. He did not see the P-51 that closed on him from above and behind, did not hear the burst of .50 caliber fire that tore through his cockpit and cut him nearly in half. His Focke-Wulf spun into the ground near a farming village, and the impact crater was deep enough that they never recovered his body. He was 24 years old. He had flown since he was 19. He had believed, until very near the end, that skill and courage and the righteousness of his cause would be enough. The mathematics said otherwise. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. On the morning of the invasion, the transformation was complete. The pilots who had mocked the Americans in the winter of 1943, who had laughed at the idea of unescorted daylight bombing, who had believed their experience and skill made them invincible, were dead or broken or flying training missions in the remnants of the Reich, teaching boys of 16 and 17 to fly aircraft for which there was no longer any fuel. The B-17s and B-24s continued their missions, 800, 900, 1,000 bombers at a time, reducing German cities to ash and rubble, destroying the rail networks, obliterating the oil refineries, grinding the industrial base of the Reich into powder. In the final months of the war, in the cellars and bunkers where German civilians sheltered from raids that came day and night without pause, there circulated a grim joke. It went like this: if the bombers are silver, take cover, they're American, and they bomb during the day. If the bombers are black, stay under cover, they're British, and they bomb at night. If there are no bombers at all, come out, that's the Luftwaffe. It was not a joke born of humor. It was a joke born of despair, of the recognition that the promise of protection had been a lie, that the vaunted Luftwaffe had been overwhelmed by an enemy whose resources were so vast, whose production so immense, whose will so implacable, that resistance had become a form of suicide. The Americans had brought to Europe a new kind of warfare, industrial warfare, where victory was determined not by the valor of individual soldiers, but by the output of factories, the efficiency of logistics, the cold calculus of production rates and loss rates and replacement rates. It was warfare without glory, without honor, without any of the romantic notions that had sent millions of young men marching to their deaths in 1914. The skies over Berlin went dark not because of cloud cover or smoke or night. They went dark because they were filled with bombers, so many that they blocked the sun, formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, a mechanical armada that represented the full industrial might of a nation that had never been bombed, had never been invaded, had never doubted that its cause was just and its victory inevitable. The German pilots who survived long enough to see this understood, finally, what they had been fighting. Not an air force, not even an army. In the spring of 1945, when the Reich lay in ruins and the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as anything but scattered remnants flying missions that accomplished nothing, a young German pilot, one of the last still alive, was captured by American forces in Bavaria. His name is lost to history. His squadron no longer existed. His airfield was a crater. During his interrogation, an American intelligence officer asked him when he knew the war was lost. The pilot thought for a long time. Then he said, "The first time I saw 100 of your bombers flying in formation, and I understood that you could afford to lose half of them and still complete the mission, and that the next day you would send 100 more. That is when I knew." The intelligence officer wrote this down. He did not respond. There was nothing to say. The pilot had understood what so many had failed to grasp until too late, that America did not win the war through superior courage or better tactics or divine favor. America won because it could afford to win, because it had built a machine for victory that ran on steel and aluminum and oil and blood, and that machine, once started, could not be stopped by anything except the complete destruction of the enemy. That was the truth the German pilots learned when the skies over Berlin went dark. That was the truth that turned their mockery to silence. The B-17s that survive today sit in museums, polished aluminum relics preserved behind velvet ropes, their guns disabled, their bomb bays empty. Children climb into them on school trips, touch the controls, peer through the bomb sites, try to imagine what it was like. They cannot. No one can unless they lived it. The cold at 30,000 feet, the oxygen mask freezing to their face, the flak bursting in black flowers all around, the fighters coming in with their cannons winking, the smell of hydraulic fluid and blood and fear. The crews who flew them are almost all gone now, scattered to time and age, taking their memories with them. But the bombers remain, and they speak, in their silence, of what happens when industrial might is wedded to moral certainty, when a democracy concludes that evil must be destroyed and bends all its resources to that task. They speak of a truth that the German pilots learned too late, that freedom, when threatened, can be as implacable and merciless as any tyranny, and far more powerful. Because freedom does not require its pilots to believe they are superior. It only requires them to believe they are right. And America, in those dark years, never doubted that it was right. The skies over Berlin went dark, and the darkness was made of bombers, and the bombers were made of American steel, and the steel was forged in the fires of a nation that could not be defeated. That was the lesson written across the sky in contrails and smoke. That was the epitaph of the Luftwaffe. That was the price of mockery.